All right, greetings everyone. Welcome and thanks so much for tuning in to this special edition of our upcoming YouTube series called Under the Radar, Exposing Extremism in America. And today, instead of kind of our normal format, we're actually doing a special edition. Today is January 6th, 2022. And so we wanted to do a kind of 1-year anniversary on the events that took place at the Capitol and kind of thinking about where we were before that moment, kind of what happened in that moment, what was going through our minds, and then kind of what we see going on into the future, both right now and then kind of down the road. And so before we do that, I think we should take a minute to just introduce ourselves to everyone. So I'll turn it over to my co-host, Brad Galloway, for him to tell us a little bit about himself.
Yeah, thanks a lot there, Alex. I'm Brad Galloway, and I'm currently working as a coordinator at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, which is located at Ontario Tech University in Oshawa. And I also am working with Life After Hate, which is an organization that I work with their program called Exit USA, which is where we look at helping individuals and families with folks that are caught up in particularly far-right extremist circles. And I'm also working along with the Organization for Prevention of Violence, which is up in Canada, and doing a lot of the same work there as a caseworker, working with families, friends, and folks that have been caught up in extremism.
Great, thanks so much. And tell us a little bit about how you came to that work and kind of what led you to that space in the first place.
Yeah, so the initial introduction to this work came through another person who had similar experiences as I had. And those experiences sort of ran from late 90s up until about 2011. I got myself wrapped up in different types of violent far-right organizations and groups, and ended up sort of involved in internationally in the far-right movement in the United States and in Canada. And short story here, there's a lot more to it than this, but around 2011, I, with the help of my wife and some others, decided that it was time to move on from this group and movement that I was a part of. And about 4 years later, I met somebody who had had similar experiences with these movements, and tried, to listen, to see where I could be part of the response to these groups with the knowledge I had, how I could help others, help civil society understand what these movements and groups are about. So yeah, then I, over time, I became sort of active in research around criminology. I was studying criminology, and ended up getting a degree in that. And I met a lot of academics that were working on this space in the studying the violent far right. So I got involved in that, and then ended up meeting some folks that were part of these with Life After Hate and with the Organization for Prevention of Violence Evolve program, and started working to help others find their way back from some of these groups. So yeah, that's the short story.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, those are much longer, and we hope to be putting together a video. Part of the video series will be kind of a discussion of some of that story, and then also a big focus on what you do now and how we get people out of that. And we'll touch on that a little bit at the end of this video as well, because I think that's important when we talk about next steps. So but yeah, thanks so much, Brad, for the introduction.
Yeah.
My name is Alex Clayton. I am an instructor, a PhD candidate, and a graduate advisor at a private university in Washington, D.C. I've lived in D.C. for the last 10 years, and I spent time here in various places. I was an intern at the Capitol building for a long time. And I worked for an NGO downtown that was at 17th in Pennsylvania, so 1 block away from the White House. And that NGO was focused on assisting people in nonviolent movements around the world to kind of resist oppression and authoritarianism. So I spent a lot of time kind of looking at the nonviolent responses, as well as kind of things like political violence and extremism, which is what I study. And I've been teaching a class on domestic terrorism and political violence for the last 5 years. And as part of my responsibilities of that, I was on a panel with Brad a number of years ago, and I really enjoyed our our back and forth, and that's part of what brought us here, is to discuss these things not from just an academic perspective and not just from a practitioner's perspective, but kind of the both sides of that, an academic and an instructor and a teacher like myself, and then Brad as a practitioner and somebody trying to pull people out, as well as a former. I think those are a lot of good perspectives that, when mixed together, gives you a more full picture than looking at just one side or the other. And so I think that's part of the reason we decided to start this series, and why we want to have this conversation today, because the talking heads have their own perspectives on this, but we're a little bit more embedded in different ways, and we wanted to give our perspectives as well. And so I think, we'll just start there. Brett, I remember right after this happened a year ago, and we had a conversation, and there were a lot of things that were going on in your mind at that time. So maybe we should start off with kind of like, where were you? What were you thinking as you were watching these events unfold a year ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can give just some context. I was sitting in my living room, and it was early, starting my workday, and I was like, here we are, here we are, and I know this sounds weird, but I feel like I was like, we deserve this. We knew that this was. I know that's a real grim, morbid thing to think, but like, we knew this stuff was going on, and we've known it's been going on for a very, very long time. And when I say stuff, I mean, we know the violent far right exists. We know these types of groups exist. And here we were. And then it came over me where I started, I was getting emotional. I knew people were most likely going to lose their lives. That hadn't occurred yet as I was watching the things unfold. But it was like, this insurrection was kind of, I thought about it in the sense of being involved in this movement at one time, and how they talked about doing stuff like that, and how they couldn't organize it, or something would always come up that it just just made it not happen. But here it was, and it was happening right at the forefront, right in front of our eyes. Everything was unfolding. And it, obviously I had my doubts, because I feel like these movements are not, they're not in any way united, in the sense of the groups being united, because I know there's a lot of infighting and a lot of that stuff. But America, over the last 4 years, under the Trump administration, things became so polarized, in the sense of like, the thing that had worked was division, and they had divided it so much that you had your regular odd person that we would hear later afterwards. We'd hear a lot of people saying, well, I was just there because I was a tourist, or I was just there because I was just looking at it, or I'm not a member of the Proud Boys, or I'm not a this, so it can't be me, right? But what that told me was that there was a lot of on the fence folks that would have just sat at home for most things, that had gone to this one, and that were participating. And more participation like that tells me about the divisiveness in America. And of course, we, with everything else that was going on over the last few years, it, since Charlottesville, you could say since then, there's been definitely an uptick in far right violence, and there we were. This was the outcome, and most unfortunately, several people lost their lives, and this has had a massive impact on the country and the world, and also particularly in the place that we work on a daily basis. This is going to be a thing that's going to be analyzed for decades. So you know how it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the insights that you had about, having been in these movements, what the goal of these movements are, to get these kind of events. And I mean, the dream for a lot of these movements is to get the couch sitters off their couch and involved. And I think the
Yeah.
thing that defines or differentiates this as an event from so many others, even like Charlottesville, is that this was that type of event. You did have that's a huge success for those movements, those groups and everything, because they are getting people. That's always been their goal. How do we get the people that are in the middle to get up and support us? And unlike Charlottesville, where again, I think almost everybody at Charlottesville that was there on the right was, pretty like a member of a group or pretty far inside that movement. Whereas
Mhm.
at the Capitol, you only have a few dozen people that are that ingrained in the movement, whereas the vast majority of them, hundreds of them, are not affiliated. They're not these
Mhm.
highly embedded individuals. And so in that way, I think it's very unique, even compared to a lot of things that have come before that even then were striking and included kind of death and destruction. It just, the context of that is very different here. Not only because of the place, the Capitol, right? Like it's not
Mhm.
just a regular courthouse. It's
No.
not, this is the U.S. Capitol building, but also because of that public or popular participation, because you've reached this tipping point where now people are like, you know what, I am going to stand up. And again, a lot of things go into that, like the coronavirus, and we've talked about this before, that there's a lot of factors, the social justice protests that came in May 2020 after George Floyd's death, and then the pandemic, and then the Trump administration sowing discontent and discord for 4 years. You kind of have this perfect stew for people to finally
Mhm.
say, you know what, I am going to go to that thing. So yeah, and I remember on
Mhm.
January 5th, I knew that the 6th was going to happen. I knew that they were planning a rally, but my wife asked me, like, what do you think is going to happen? I was like, nothing big, because in my mind, we'd seen the Proud Boys come to DC in December, just a month earlier, and promised to do this big thing. There was a little bit of violence, but it wasn't huge. I'd seen them make these kind of promises. Oh, we're going to show up, we're going to show up. And I just didn't believe it. And so
Yeah.
really on January 5th, January 6th was not possible in a lot of
Mhm.
people's minds. It's like we couldn't even see the possibility, right? And then for me, yeah, just like you, I was watching in shock. I mean, I
Mhm.
worked there, I walked those halls, um,
Mhm.
and one of the things that I will say, one of the big positives here, although it doesn't quite seem like it, is like if we think about the worst case scenario, and like you, I was watching, I was expecting bombs to go off, I was expecting guns to
Yeah.
start firing. I was convinced that members of Congress were going to be assassinated that day. That this was, when I was watching people break in, I that said this is the beginning of what's going to be worse. And so I will say that we are very fortunate that it wasn't worse, because it hang Mike Pence 2 doors down
Yeah.
from the members. And I mean, angry mobs are not controllable. I don't even know if Trump went down there and said stop. I don't even know if they would have listened to him, because the mob mentality doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so in a lot of ways, the Capitol Police deserve a ton of credit, like a
Mhm.
huge amount of credit, for standing up and basically preventing a massacre, changing it from, instead of being a massacre, it was an insurrection. And it was violent and people died and 140 police officers were injured. But the casualty numbers, and especially in terms of deaths, I think could have been much,
Mhm.
much higher. The security breach, the level of security breach did not match the outcome, which we're fortunate, because that level of security breach could have led to like literally the bombing and burning of the Capitol building and the assassination of multiple members. And it didn't, but it was this close. And I think that's a good thing. On the other hand, I think 1 year later, people have become very complacent because it didn't quite reach that level, right?
Mhm.
It's a lot easier to deny these things happened and say, oh, it wasn't that, when you don't have that level, right? So I'm glad that it wasn't like that, but it's also kind of unfortunate for American politics, because it's almost like it needed to be more shocking to really get everybody to say no more. And they did in the beginning. The Republicans, Lindsey Graham, McCarthy, we've got all this evidence that this is too much. And then within a couple of weeks, a couple of months, that all starts to backtrack in a big way, so.
Yeah. I mean, you brought up something really important, and that was like the symbolism of it, of the buildings, what this means. It wasn't just a regular courthouse. It wasn't just, this is a monumental event that meant a lot more as this thing was unfolding than we would we would know. And I know some of the things that I recognized right at those moments when this was happening, and what things like hang Mike Pence, that this is a political figure in the United States, the vice president, all this kind of thing. That that alone means a lot. But I was looking around outside to see what things, who might have been there, what types of folks are there. So I mean, I saw one thing that really got me was the gallows with the rope hanging, and within far right circles, that what's a very popular thing is the day of the rope, so the end of times. And you look in the Turner Diaries, which is obviously fictional, but portrays the beginning of the race war, and the day of the rope and all of this kind of thing. So that's how I knew there was right-wing extremists there that were not your everyday average American Trump supporter Republican. These people were serious, and they were there. Like you said, there was dozens of them that were affiliated with actual groups, whether it be Patriot Front or Proud Boys or whoever. But they were there, and they were there to do violence. And we can't ever undermine that, because some of the symbolism told us a very different story, that this wasn't just a protest. This was more than that. And these folks know, and that's why they wore certain things or did certain things. And yes, kudos to all of the law enforcement officials that worked on that day. And thankfully, there weren't more casualties than there were. And I think they did a good job in preventing more from happening. But man, the seriousness, once I started seeing some of the symbolism, I was like, man, I was expecting, just like you, I was like, when are the guns coming out? When are the bombs going to happen? That was all very right in the front of mind at that moment, and it's tough to watch these things, because in the sense of, like, what did we see? It was, I forget how many months later, but there was a incident where they were worried about a guy with a car near the Capitol with the bombs in it. Could be kind of situation. That's what this does for these movements. It creates this space where they've done this now. They've gone there. They've done this. So what can the next guy do? It's that extremism building ladder where they want to one up each other. And I think that's what you were sort of alluding to, is that this is some of it's broken groups and people who were fence sitters at some point, and they don't really know what they're doing, and it was just mob violence. And then there's some of these guys who are like, yeah, that was the chance to do it. Like, that was a chance to get in there and make an impact, right? So yeah.
And it's the marriage of those two things that creates the instability that destabilizes things, right? Because again, like, if you want to go back, and we want to be careful to not spend too much time looking at history with like a magnifying glass, because things can happen differently in the future than they did in the past. But if you look at kind of what happened with the rise of the Nazis, right? It's not that the Nazis' views like took over the popular viewpoint. It's that they were able to convince the majority of the population, the fence sitters, that extra security was needed for these other reasons, right? And so, but you have this weird amalgamation, and they can't get that without pulling in the people that sit in the middle. And so again, this event is a shining light to anybody who holds these extremist beliefs, because if you're watching that like us, you're going, oh my gosh, what's happening? But if you're watching it as one of them, you're cheering, right? This is like a moment. It's a milestone, and it's a shining beacon for everybody. And we talked about how disparate these groups are, but I guarantee you in that moment, they were almost all the same. Do you know what I mean? Because this was their shared goal. And so those things unify. Even disparate groups have the ability to unify. And that does a lot for recruitment. It does a lot for what you're saying, like the one up, right? How are we going to one up each other? Oddly enough, extremists like to do things extremely. And so once they reach some sort of goalpost or milestone, that's what they do. They push it to the next stage. Okay, let's do bigger, let's do better. And a lot of that, again, even without the casualties on the level that they could have been, that doesn't get erased, right? Because now they see what they're capable of. I also don't want to gloss over the fact that there were bombs that were placed there, right? So, we're not just talking like theoretically this could have been, like, we're talking like a hair's trigger And I was reading an article just recently about the death of Ashley Babbitt, the one protester who was killed. And she was killed as she was climbing in the window where the members were. And it's become such a lightning rod for the right that Ashley Babbitt's this martyr and this patriot. And again, I like these counterfactuals. What if he doesn't shoot her, right? And then she gets in, that bolsters everybody else. It might have been that one shot that stopped it from being more violent. I don't know. I wasn't there, but it just, and again, that one shot that actually wound up saving a bunch of people's lives now turns into a touch point for an entire right-wing movement. That now she's a martyr, and again, they're framing it like that, when in reality, what that was the iron wall that prevented a lot of worse things from happening. And maybe that's why they martyr her, because that's what they wanted, and again, there's two components here, and I keep coming back to this the more I'm 1 year later. There's an insurrection and there's a coup, and they were concurrent, but they're not the same, and the coup failed. And so the insurrection was primed and prepped to make up for the failed coup as a last ditch attempt. But the insurrection is, we're all talking about January 6th and the insurrection, but that's not actually the main show. The main show is the coup, because that's where they were actively working to undemocratically overturn the results of the election. And they weren't able to convince enough people. And so they tried to push a violent mob down to create more craziness and uncertainty to push it over. But again, those are two separate things. They just happen to be associated with one another. And I think people just think the insurrection was all it was, but really there's so much more that went into the coup planning part of it. And a lot of people that are being arrested are just pawns. They're just they're just patsies. Whereas the people pulling the strings, the people that paid for people to get there, rented buses, loaded people up, sent out messages, put out, a lot of those people are not being held responsible yet. And that's very problematic, right? I think so. Yeah. So let's pick it up there. Let's 1 year later, what are you thinking about the results and what we're seeing and things like that?
Yeah, I think this is an influential moment to be sitting here a year later to be saying, hey, look, here's what we've observed. Here's what here's some of the things that the government has been doing since then, to look back on it, to open that lens and say, okay, here we're going to start this committee. We're going to do all of this stuff to look into it. But I'm kind of looking at it like this. So organized hate movements, organized violent far right extremist movements, we're all over this. The way they view themselves after this, they are more patriotic than any time before, right? You spend time in these forums and all the different areas of the internet that most people don't go, and we look at this information and the way that they talk about how they feel about what happened. And when I say they, I mean folks who were involved or supporters of the insurrection. And they say, things like, it was a win for us, like you were saying, building upon it, saying, well, no, this is a step in the right direction. This is a building block. But they also say, it built a belief for the idea that Trump could come back in 2024. Like they're trying to build a figurative hard line here that we'll get more supporters and we'll have, we'll win the next election. They still believe that the reason for the insurrection, that he won that, and it was taken from them. So they want to get it back. And a lot of the rhetoric is that take it back by any means necessary, which is in their minds the most patriotic thing that any American can do, which, in the idea within the movement, from my perspective, reading that as a person that has experiences from that movement, I'm looking at it going, yeah, this is the idea of the racial patriot and the person who's a separatist, the person who's going to take back the country. That was the idea of the order in the 1980s. We're going to be white separatists, and we're going to take back the Pacific Northwest, and we're going to build a brand new America under, the guise of white supremacy, right? And that's what's really underneath all of this. But if they can get as many pawns in this game, right, to do the work for them to get that done. I mean, we look at bigger things like the accelerationist groups that have spawned up over the last number of years. This is their dream, to have stuff like this happening, because they don't have to go out into civil society to do the violence. Now they can sit and watch it burn down from the comforts of their own homes. Right. And now that's a weird thing to think about, is it not? We have now extremists who are just viewers, and they're planning. Yes, they're training, they're doing all these things. But a lot of the stuff I'm seeing is that they're just enjoying all of this civil unrest. They're enjoying the racial tensions. They're enjoying all of the stuff that's building up. And that's that complex of, the end of days, we can take this over, and we can, that the idea of the Great Reset, all of the bigger things that are, that we all know about within our circles of research and looking at terrorism and violent extremism in the United States. This is like particularly probably one of the most important things for them, in the sense of using it in whichever ways benefit them, right? Like you said, Ashley Babbitt using that as a martyrdom is a huge thing across terrorism, and I think they'd fail without it, right? They need a person or people to bring their movements up to say, "Oh, look, we were slighted. Here's why," right? And that's the same thing with Robert Matthews from the Order. Like they still to this day are celebrating the day of his death when he was killed by the FBI. Like it's something that I don't think has changed, and that's something that's clear across these far right movements that will continue to go on. And I'm particularly concerned when we overlook a lot of those things, and we just focus on, well, we should be okay, we can move forward, we can just all heal from this. Well, I hope so. But we also have to keep in mind what we need to do. We need to bolster our efforts, and that's building knowledge, but also being able to acknowledge things that are going on in the background from these groups, and why and what these things are. I think you explained it really eloquently about what this really means, right? And it's a lot bigger than the insurrection itself, and that coup is such a huge part of it as well, because that election, what that means, that piece is a rhetoric point. It's going to continue to be so, and we have to be ever so security. The security agencies that are working on this have to be ever so, be available for new information, and to be listening to all these fantastic researchers that are out there, and analysts that are out there looking at a lot of the groups in the background that are planning and using these things for deliberate action later, right? So anyway, that's just some really grim analysis from my point, but yeah, that's what it is.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. Going back to what you're saying about these extremists who are kind of like sitting back and watching things now, it's interesting because, again, a lot of these issues have gone back for many, many years, again, with the Order and trying to set things up. But it feels like with the election of Trump that a lot of those things have kind of snowballed to the point where, like, to get traction on those issues, you had to do a lot of work in the past, right? Whereas now you don't have to do much to stir the bear, right? Like, again, it might have taken a violent street clash before to get your name in the book. Now you just have to hold a sign up somewhere, like next to a government institution, say, "I'm an oath keeper." And because those issues have been raised so prominently in people's minds, they're right next to the surface. So it's a lot easier for those people to they don't have to do as much to poke it, to provoke. And let's face it, half of what they do is provocation. Like that's the name of their game. Like, that's even how half of the people come into these movements, is like they're basically glorified trolls, and they enjoy trolling very, very much. And they like that gets a rise out of people, but they're pushing people's buttons, and they like that. And before, it took more to do that. But again, now, because of not only these circumstances with the politically, but also economically and socially and health policy wise, all those things, it's a lot easier to get a rise out of people. And that's what they want, right? That puts them closer to the top, as opposed to buried under the popular culture, and swept into the dustbin of history, so to speak. No, they're right next to the surface of kind of popular culture right now, and that's what they want. Not in a good way, but as you know, for these groups, no press is bad press, or there's no bad press. Like if you're being talked about, it's a good thing for you. And so yeah, so they're not looking at this going, well, yeah, we're being talked about a lot, but it's in bad light. Like they don't care, they're being talked about. And for every 100 people that watch a broadcast about them, 99 people are abhorred, and one person goes, I want to learn more. And that's what they want. They just want to get that one out of every 100, because again, you aggregate that up, you show that to 1 million people, that's thousands of potential recruits. And that's where the media plays right into these hands sometimes, because they're playing for the 99 and not always thinking about what that story is going to do for that one, or what that exposure of these ideals, or what the exposure of this group, because they'll put up like, and here's their website. Like, do you have to do that? Like, do you really, like, journalistically, do you really have to do that? Things like that. So it's a lot easier for them, like I said, to take a back seat because people are going to pop up. They're also glorifying things like Kyle Rittenhouse, right? And we talked about this recently, but they're going to glorify that because that's normal people taking initiative, literally taking up arms on behalf of the movement. And that's why they're taking pictures with him in the bar afterwards, right? And that's why they go to, what is it, the conference, and somebody asks them, what's it like to shoot a liberal, to shoot one of those stupid liberals? They're glorifying that, they're celebrating that. And one other thing I wanted to bring up, because we were talking about this kind of the presence of violence and stuff, is like, there was a recent poll, and you and I both know, most people have probably seen it, but like there's about 30% of the country right now that believes that violence may be necessary to retake the government, So that like belief that violence is okay, right, has been rising. And that's where you get this kind of weird cocktail of social instability, economic frustration, health policy issues, distrust in government, and then boom, now people are like, well, you know what, maybe a violent change is necessary. And again, you don't have to hit some massive point where like 60% believe it. Like 30% is pretty close to what you need to basically start a violent civil war, because people will take up arms and things like that. So I struggle a year later with trying to differentiate between like my worst fears. Again, just like watching the Capitol, my worst fear was that there was going to be death and destruction. That's not what happened. My worst fear here is that this was just stage one of a coup that's going to be completed, and that we're on a slide to dictatorship, like an inevitable slide. Like there's very little that we can do because the system's not built to deal with these issues. Just like in Germany, right? The Weimar Republic was not built to deal with that kind of extremism. So I'm caught between that on one pole, and on the other pole is basically like, that's not, like, American civil society is not built like German civil society was. Like, we're not, like, there's so much more connections between people across places and time, and America's much bigger. And I'm caught between the kind of worst case scenario and kind of trying to like have faith in people that would not, like, as much as we talk about these big figures and names and organizations, I don't know if there's enough people, just normal everyday people, that would go along with it for that to ever happen. And to be honest, when I'm reading some of the stuff about why the coup failed, it's things like State Department employees refuse to cooperate, Justice Department employees. These are not big name people. These are the middle level, low level guys that are like, we're not doing that, and those people make a big difference, and again, we focus so much on the big name people, but it takes, people to populate a movement. That's one of the things I learned from my time studying nonviolence. People power is by far the most powerful political piece you can have, because if you have that much people power, nobody can stop you. And that's in some ways what they're trying to build in a kind of underhanded, deceitful way. But they've had a fair amount of success. And so I'm caught between this, like, oh my God, they're going to pull the wool over enough people's eyes, and people's grandparents, aunts and uncles, and people that normally would never be cool with that kind of stuff are now going, you know what, it's so messed up anyway, who cares? Just throw the grenade. So I'm caught between thinking the worst versus the best, which is no, I have faith in these people. They will like, we will not become a Nazi country, a fascist country, because we're not Nazis. We're not fascists. But I honestly can't throw my weight between one or the other. You know what I mean? And of course, life isn't extremes, but in my mind, I'm kind of oscillating between some of these two positions, which is like, it's going to be okay. Like the American people will persevere and they will overcome this threat. And the other side, it's like, this is the end of the democracy. Like we've already kind of seen that start happen. And now it's just an inevitable process to the end, because there's nobody around to stop it, because they've placed all the right people in all the right places. They got the momentum, and there's just not enough coordination on the other side for a coordinated response to it, you know? So I don't know. Anyway, what about you? What are you thinking here?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I've seen over the last year is also some interesting analysis from sort of mainstream. Sometimes it's comedy TV shows. Sometimes it's so in response pattern. How do we respond to all of this rhetoric? How do we, as a country, as people, look at this and go, well, here's what we've got to do. We've got to respond to all this negative, violent, extremist rhetoric with something else. We've got to come together. We've got to build a point where we can somehow get along, whether we're Republicans or Democrats or nonviolent advocates or anti-racists, leftists, conservatives. How do we have a common ground, which equals not another insurrection, not the end of times? Because that's what I can imagine, when something struck me, but, when you said the commoner, like Aunt Faye or whoever, Uncle Bob, are now getting involved in, QAnons, all of this other stuff that's going on. Like, what is the next step there to help those folks go, maybe this isn't it. Maybe it is America is more important than QAnon, white supremacy, all the other options that you can get into ideologically. Like, what's more important? Just the fabric of the American people, liberal democracy. What's more important, right?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the best. So this is a great point, and I wanted to tell this story. I'm glad you reminded me of this. But I was reading an article, and I'm going to post it in the description for the video here. And it's kind of talking about, how do we get over this? How do we overcome this? How basically, like, a civil war may be coming. How do we stop it? And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting article to write right now. But it starts with a story at the Capitol attack, where one of the police officers got shoved into the crowd, and they start beating him, tasing him, the typical whatever. He's screaming, he's pleading. They're literally threatening him with his own firearm. And he says, "I'm a dad, I have kids." And in that moment, he's surrounded by like 4 or 5 other people who step around him and say, no, don't touch this guy. And they create a kind of funnel back through the crowd and get him back up with the rest of the police. And this article was great about saying, that's the answer, right? It's seeing this humanity. Like, when they saw him as a cop and an enemy, and not an enemy, but an actor of the state and all these other things. But when they saw him as a dad, as a family member, somebody who had kids, not all of them, but enough of them said, whoa, what are we doing here? And that's that piece where, like, I have this faith in the American people that, like, we're not all gone, that people will stop and say, whoa, wait a second. Like, if victory requires me to shoot and kill this person who's a dad, who's just, basically, he may be the wrong place, wrong time, my enemy, but is that death necessary? And I thought that was a great illustration of kind of, even in the heat of that moment that we're talking about now, there was this little bristle of humanity that allowed that police officer to survive, probably, or at least not sustain heavier injuries. And so anyway, it goes on in this article, and again, I'll pass that along in the description for the video. But it says a couple things about finding common ground, and about, whatever it is, like, we have to focus wholeheartedly on the things that we share, right? And create spaces where that's okay. And there are a bunch of organizations that are out there that connect people on the left and the right, and sit them down for conversations with one another. And so as we move into this kind of final stage of the video here, which is like, what can we do? How can we respond to that? And on a very basic level, the first level is to basically, like, understand that these people who you don't agree with in any way, shape, or form are still human beings. They still have a modicum of humanity. They still have their beliefs and their dreams, and they may be totally wacky to us, like hurtful wacky, but that doesn't actually make them inhuman, right? Even if they see other people as inhuman, that doesn't make them inhuman. And so identifying people as humanity and pushing through that initial part, because right now that's what's driving polarization. It's we don't want to see the humanity in the people that are calling for, like, you know, minorities to be forcibly removed from the country, right? And like that is admittedly extremely difficult, you know. But to quote Brian Stevenson, you know, in his book Just Mercy, you know, mercy is at its most powerful when it's least deserved, right? And I think the same thing here, that it's not going to be doubling down on violence and on I'm right, you're wrong. It's going to be a step back and think real hard, like, is what I'm about to say right now, am I saying this for me, or am I saying this for us, for a better outcome, right? And I think that stop and that moment is going to save a lot of lives and a lot of heartache and troubles down the road if we can all identify that, find a way to communicate with people, even if we don't agree with them, on some level, right? And like, even if it's like, you know, I don't know, I'm a big Denver Broncos sports fan, right? So like, you know, you could talk to people about like the littlest things are building blocks for a human relationship, you know? And so on the most basic level, that's what I'm seeing, right? Is you can either kind of withdraw into yourself and start becoming an extremist, which is like all Republicans or all conservatives or whatever are evil, whatever. Like you could slip right into that same spot that you know, that these people we're talking about are in, but that doesn't solve any of the problems, right? And as opposed to that, again, you can kind of turn around and say, look, like crimes were committed, like people need to be punished and held to account, but there's still a human element, and there's still a lot of concerns that these people have that are at least worth talking about and listening to, right? And maybe once you uncouch that from some of the racist rhetoric, those are the same problems that a lot of other people are having. Because it turns out modern society is not great for fulfilling people's wants and needs. And the inability to get those wants and needs fulfilled manifests in different ways for different people, right? And after years and years and years, or after a family history of being raised in racism or whatever it may be, that can take a lot of different forms, right? And so, but we're still talking about a root cause, which is like, we're all pretty unhappy with what we've set up in modern democracies. It's just not doing it. So how do we do that better? You know, those are tough conversations, but that's the real conversation here. Not necessarily how hard do we punish these people, or how do we eradicate white supremacy? Like that's no, those are not the conversations, right? Those are still worth, like, how do we reduce the influence of these things? How do we be strategic? But the most basic conversation is like, how do we build towards a future that works for a lot more people?
Yeah, I think that's key, because that will lead to the dismantling of the bads and evils of the world, or whatever, if you will. And that's like you know, the roots of the work that I work in, along with Life After Hate and the Evolve program up in Canada, is really about understanding people, right? You know, we're literally working with people who were wrapped up in these movements, and not judging them based on, well, you were in that group, you are the worst, you deserve 100 years in prison. It's you deserve a way back into society, and we want to help you pave that way. There will be some tough times for you on the way back. I know, I experienced it, and I know many other people who have, but the road is there for you. We can help you. Yeah. And society should have open arms to help folks. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have gotten wrapped up in extremist rhetoric. Are they violent extremists? Not all of them yet, right? But should we help these folks? We should, I think, because what's in the fabric of America is helping the other. I mean, we look at the very beginnings of people immigrating from Europe over here, all of that kind of thing. Like, that's what was the point of that, though? Was it to discourage and hurt people? You know, we obviously have learned from some horrible things that we did as people back then too, but we have to look at it as, if we don't keep learning from that, we can also learn from these folks who've been wrapped up in these movements. We can say, hey, they got wrapped up in that. They were at the insurrection. They did such, they did their, in 10 years or whatever, when someone gets out that did something horrible during that time, do we forgive them right away? No, probably not. But can we help them pave their way back to be a part of civil society and be part of good? Be, who knows? Maybe one of those people is the next person who's doing, some form of critical work that helps society. But if we don't help them get back around, there's no way back like that. And we have to be welcoming as much as damning. We have to be able to say, hey, look, you were a violent extremist, or you were a terrorist, or you were whatever. But does that labeling really help at the end of the day? I don't know if it does. I think what it does do is it help society say, oh, well, okay, let's throw them in prison. Let's do that. Okay, cool. They do deserve punishment, granted, but how do we help them? Because that punishment at some point will be over. Somebody who just went to the insurrection and was photographed that they were there, they're not going to get 50 years in prison and die in prison. It's not going to work like that. They're going to get some of the sentences I've been looking at. I know we talked about this, about, kind of looking at what is the punitive outcome for some of these people. Well, some of it won't be much.
Right. 3-4 years in prison max with suspended sentences. And I mean, there were people from the BLM protests that got way longer sentences than anybody in the capital rights so far. So
this is that's what we have to think about, is that, if we're not creating, so that's the bigger picture. If we're not creating a fair and equal justice system, then this stuff is going to continue, right? It's going to, and that divisiveness, that whole polarization piece, all of that. And this kind of leads back to one of my main points, which I think one of your colleagues there, they wrote a book about how the extreme has gone mainstream. Well, that's what the point of these extremist groups is to get this, push this into the mainstream, so it's just acceptable.
Right.
And then it's like, here we are, but we don't care because it's acceptable.
Right.
Like, this is just, that's that part of society. So we've now moved from, wanting to be sort of centrist or not being partisan on issues, but now it's like, forget it. There's that, and we're so far away from each other that the middle ground is only just fighting. And that's what's, I think, sort of happened here. And, we've got to be able to find a way back, and that human crisis, we can intervene and we can be part of the way back. But I think, and some of my colleagues may not like this, but it's criticizing some of the work we do is so important here, is to know, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't, increase doxing and increase this stuff of folks who are involved in this stuff. Maybe we should find better ways to help them back. Maybe we should create programs for when they get out of prison. There's going to be a lot of people with prison sentences here coming up that are associated with this stuff. Yeah. Do we have? I don't think we have something that's set up for them at this point. That's something that we need to look at.
I read an article just today about a son who turned his father in, and the dad went to jail, and he's becoming more radicalized in jail.
I saw that.
Yeah. And to your point, again, when we talk about like these people deserve to be punished, and that's, again, you break the law, there's punishment. But the issue here is that like the system that we have is not actually designed very well for the type of punishment we need, right? Which would include things like de-radicalization programs, right? While you're in prison, right? Like you're going to be there, like, again, how do we think of making people when they return like productive, acceptable members of society, right? But that has to start with this piece. And I think this was so important, what you were talking about earlier, is like we can use all these labels and things like that. But like one of the most important things for people to hear when they're coming back is like, we want you back. We want you in society. Like we want to welcome you back, right? It can't start with like, you're a terrorist and you're this and you're that, and we're going to do this because the court made us do it. No, it starts with like, yo, you're a human being and we want you back in society. And here are the things you're going to have to do. And here, again, trust has to be rebuilt. There's all these other things, but it has to start with this, like, we want you here. We want you as part of this. And I know that sounds silly, but I think there's a lot of people that do not get that, don't hear that, right? And it creates a lot of these issues, which is like, they don't feel like they're included, that they're important, that anybody cares about them. So one of the most important things that anybody can say to anybody else is, I'm glad you're here, right? And we want you here. I'm glad that I want you to be part of society. I want to have these conversations with you about how you think differently than I do. That may not be, one-to-one, but I'd rather have that conversation than not. And those kinds of things, saying those kinds of things can go a long way, because people see their utility, right? They're like, oh, I'm helping you, cool. Whereas if they don't feel that way, they'll go talk to a bunch of other people in their echo chamber and just build each other up. And again, we know that's how violence happens, right? Is when people kind of recede from kind of mainstream society, kind of go back into their tiny violent echo chambers, and then they build each other up because they're not being socialized outside of that tiny little echo chamber. So everything they do is acceptable. And that's happening right before our eyes. So one of the things we need to do is break the echo chamber, right? And that starts with like acknowledging people's humanity, listening to people. And I need to do better, right? There are family members that I have not talked to as much as I should because I'm ashamed, right? And I have to get over that. I have to overcome that and say to myself, like, no, what's more important, you have to be bigger than this. We all have to. If we want to overcome it, like, we all have to be a little bit bigger than the moment if we're going to rise, if we're going to get over the hump, So that's going to take some hard stuff, which is like talking to people and like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you thinking this way? Like, what what are the concerns that you really like? What are you scared of? Like, what are the concerns that you really have? And even just those awkward basic conversations, I think that can help diffuse a lot of things. Because again, people don't feel like they're being listened to, and that like what they have to say matters, and that's what helped get us in this problem, in this place in the first place. So other things, so we talked, are there opportunities with your organizations to volunteer, or are there other organizations that you can think of that would, that people can kind of look into, or obviously donate, but also maybe donate time and not just money and things like that? Any ideas?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know with Life After Hate, there's we can post in the comments too, and after I can post the website and all that too. There's an application there for volunteer work, and there's to learn about the organization, and as far as I know, I think there's some trainings coming up for those who are already kind of working in the space too, to sort of broaden their horizons on what this work looks like. Which is an important dynamic too. You can't just be doing the work in the background and then not leaving it open to for people to find out about. Also, with the Evolve program, there was a 2-year report on what the program has been doing over the last couple of years, which is really helpful. It breaks down sort of numbers and breaks down the science of how a de-radicalization program or intervention program works in this sense. And that's also really interesting information. I can also post that as well. I think as far as resources go, there are up and coming programs that I know of that are working in the same space. And I think that one of the biggest things in that area is standardizing it across so that it's more available, as we know that there are people out there, man, that are sitting there that are going, I just need help. I just need to get through this. I know I made some mistakes. How do I get through? And this I can attest to. I've helped people who are serving prison sentences right now. I've worked with folks who are family members of such, that people do want to change, and they just need the resources, and that's what's got to be thought about here too. That people in civil, like you just said, I should be better with my relatives, being more open to talking with them, but us knowing as family members too, we can't do it all. So having extra resources outside of that, coupled with family and friends and folks who can help around, it's being able to have those non-judgmental conversations with family members or friends who have gotten caught up with this stuff. Like, but we have to all have a limit and boundary for ourselves to be part of these conversations, but also say, look, I'm a little bit emotionally drained by this, because it can be that there's a lot to it. The work is often not simple and isn't just over a couple of days. It could be years. There are people I've worked with a for many years of trying to help them even just disengage from the groups. So it takes time and energy, and we understand that everybody each person is an individual who's gotten themselves involved in a collective. So there are ways in with people. We just need to respect that. We need to respect their boundaries and know that they probably have shame and guilt and all these other things that are going on about being a part of these groups, or even deeper issues within their lives. So having multifaceted programs available that have, mental health resources, or just, group chats for family members that have folks who've become involved in extremism, so they can talk to each other, which Life After Hate has that as a resource. Like, it is a good time that we're living in the sense of that there's big buy-in on these types of programs from certain areas, because I think it should be a part of what's available. And as we talked about a bit earlier, for people who are in these groups, it's got to be known that it's there. I mean, I had the moments in myself where I sat there and I wished there was a program while I was sitting in these groups going, oh, where could I get help? There was just no way out. But now it exists. So as a response, I think this is one of the responses that's elemental in being able to help folks leave these, different types of movements. And I will say that it's not a political thing. It's not a partisan thing. This is not a left versus right. This is not a centrist thing. This is not a libertarian thing. This is not a whatever. This is here we are. We want to help human beings from whatever sides of extremism that they want to come at from, to get help to leave violent lifestyles behind, right? And that's, I think people miss that sometimes. Yes, Life After Hate specifically helps people leave the far right, but there are organizations that are helping, like the Evolve program, that are helping people leave Islamic-inspired extremist groups, leave the left, leave QAnon conspiracy theorists, all of this stuff. We need to think about this as a bigger picture, that people do deserve help.
Right.
So how do we do that? Right.
Well, and like, we happen to be living in like a right-wing kind of peak moment, but if we were to turn back the clock 40 or 50 years, it'd be a left-wing peak moment, right? Where like basically the biggest threat in the US was left-wing extremism, and so yeah, it's not about the ideology itself. It's about the extremism that accompanies it, and the justification for the use of violence, right? And again, we've gone back and forth and talked about this a lot. Extremist views are abhorrent, right? But those are views. It's what people do based on those views, right? I can ignore a person's opinion, but when they start taking action, violent or policy, based on those, then it becomes a big problem, right? So yeah, and I think, again, this kind of knowing where your limits are, right? What you were saying, Brad, is so healthy, because this isn't like you're just going to sit there and just take everything, right? You still have to, it's a way to be honest, right? Like, that's the most important thing, but also like understanding and like, I don't know if courteous is the best word, like respectful on the way that you want it to be respectful. They may not always do it respectfully, but for you. And it's okay to be honest and say like, yep, that crossed my line. I can't really continue this discussion right now. Maybe I'll think about it and I'll come back. And again, to your point, if you get to that point, you look for other resources, right? You don't have to do it alone, right? If it gets to that point where you're like, I can't handle this, then maybe it is worth contacting another organization, and or seeking out other resources, because you're not alone there. And again, more and more of these things are becoming available, so yeah. And I'll just plug one more time for these groups that are kind of not extremist based or hate group based, but just taking people from the left and the right and putting them in a conversation with one another. That's something that's really easy that anybody could do. And I think, I don't know, maybe it's morbid to think this way, but I think a lot of people, right, if you look at this individual, like you said, if we have somebody that's been to prison, they did something bad, but they want to get better. It could be that like 5 years, 10 years down the road after they get out, they could be a tremendous influence on helping pull people out of this movement. They might wind up saving thousands of lives because we gave them a chance to rehabilitate themselves, right? Or if we treat it the wrong way, they might go out and commit more violence, right? So you have to think of people sometimes, and again, I'm thinking about the coup and these extremes. I think sometimes in people, you have to kind of think in those extremes too. Like if we don't do what we can do now, this person might go out and do the exact same thing or worse. And so what have we accomplished? What does the punishment accomplish? What's the point of criminal justice system if we can't prevent people from going back out and doing the thing that they did to get them here, right? Versus the other side, which is if we do this right and we rehabilitate this person could become a contributing member of society. Will they ever be able to bring back the life that they took or the violence they committed? No, but there are ways to contribute to society meaningfully after that. And again, there's so many people that are told basically like, we don't want your contributions. So because because they were once a criminal. So what's your incentive to do that? And so again, this opening line of like, we want you here, we want you to come back to society, can be this opening salvo to motivate people to contribute again, and it's kind of counterintuitive because you want to double down and push people away when they do bad things. But in reality, and again, there's some people that are never going to change. Got that. But you don't approach somebody assuming that they're one of those people, because then you'll never get it. It's like winning the lotto. You're never going to win if you don't buy a ticket. So a person's never going to de-radicalize or come out of a movement or whatever, think differently unless you make that effort, So anyway, I'm hopeful that a lot of people that are listening are getting something out of this and are thinking about some personal situations in their life. And maybe this adds some context and stuff. But just, I think it's important. You're not alone. I think everybody is touching on this in some way. They have a friend, they have a family member that, nobody here gets to sit on the sidelines completely. We're all connected to this issue in some way, much like climate change and the pandemic. This is something that touches everybody. And we've been pushing for people to understand that for a very long time. And it just, again, one of the good things about what's happened is that it's really raised the prominence of these things in a lot of people's minds, if not as many as we would like, but a lot more people are aware of it than they ever have been. So now we just have to stay vigilant and take the knowledge we have, add to that knowledge and get better and refine our techniques. And, we're never going to be able to eradicate these things, but we can certainly tamp down their influence to where they're little specks of insignificant dust. You're like, yeah, there's still white supremacy, but they hang out in their little tiny circles and they do their thing and the rest of the world flourishes, so.
That's the building points, man. And I think that we can get there as a society. We can get to a point where we're just, it isn't just a judgment society where everything is about us and them. And that's what this whole deal is. And, we talk about now, I see so many articles out there after the insurrection, after after January 6th, what do we do now? What's the next steps? Well, I think one of the first steps is humanity, understanding people lost their lives, those are victims of these times that we're living in. And part of the rebuild is helping victims of violent extremism. So definitely talking about that and broadening the dialogue about that, about how we can do that. But also, yes, helping perpetrators. How can we help them see a different scenario for their life where they don't need to use violence to, it's not about changing minds per se. I know that sounds weird, but it's not like, hey, you must now think like this. No, it's, hey, let's respect each other and let's try to live in an America that we both enjoy. It's not of course, there's been civil rights leaders for decades and decades have been talking about, particularly Martin Luther King has some amazing quotes about how we can be living in unity here and why we should, right? And that's what we should be looking at, trying to get better at as human beings, to get better at unifying whatever it is that I know we all have the idea about. How do we work and live in this present day together? Well, let's make the extremists, no matter which type of them they are, let's make them a little blip or a grain of sand, like you say, and let's try to move forward, right? And that's the and we can do that together, no matter where we stand on the today's political spectrum. We can say we don't need extremists, we don't need violence. Let's figure out a way we can, look at that, and let's help out those folks where of course within reason. Like you've said, there are some folks who, unfortunately, that's not going to be a thing. You think about throughout history, Oklahoma City, that was not somebody who was going to be helped. That was, and the most unfortunate outcome that could have ever, happened, right? But that's 9/11. We think about what violent extremism and terrorism has done, but we can use those things to unify ourselves, saying we don't want those things to happen, and not in a unified America. We don't want that. And can't we think about it from a human perspective like that, right? Like, this is not about Republican, Democrat. That's even too small in that sense. Let's think of it as a broader sense. How do we piece this together where, there just isn't violent extremism and terrorism? I mean, obviously there always probably will be, but how do we reduce it to a point where we're not imploding on ourselves, though?
Right. Yeah, to where it's so central in how we define ourselves. Yeah. And I think, again, that's a good quote to end on, which is, we can do it. It's possible, not to like eliminate things, but to reduce these things, to make a better world. It's possible. And I think a lot of people, the world has kind of made it to where it's very defeatist sometimes, and it makes you want to think that things aren't possible, but they absolutely are. A different way is possible. Like, we're going through it right now. That's why people are feeling the upheaval, because we're going through different ways of living. And it's possible. A new world that's pushes things forward from where we are now to the next stage, certainly possible. And it's not going to happen without growing pains. Like, you didn't think it was going to be easy, did you? So another way of looking at what's going on right now is these are the hemorrhages that happen with growth spurts, right? But every moment that's like that has an equal chance to fall back into darkness as it does to be a growth spurt, right? So that's that vigilant piece, that like, you can't just accept these things that are happening externally and like just be a backseat driver. Like, we have roles to play as this develops. This is not history that we're reading in a book from 150 years ago. This is what's unfolding before us, and we have roles to play in it. And if we don't like accept that and embrace that, it's not going to be this hemorrhage on a growth spurt. It's going to be a hemorrhage that leads to a regression, right? And so that's the ownership piece. The vigilance and the ownership piece are so important here, because yes, we can, but we have to actually do it, right? We can't just saying here and saying yes we can is not enough. It's not enough to just say it. We have to do more, and that includes, like I said, very basic level conversations and moving all the way up. So
absolutely, for sure, man. Yep.
Well, great. Well, thanks to everybody who watched the video. We hope this was helpful for you, and look for some of our other videos in this series on the Under the Radar, exposing extremism in America. And we will see you in the future. Thanks, everybody.